Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone, for attending. It is a very interesting topical discussion, and I think part of the good thing with the presenters we have is we're going to come at it from a bunch of different angles. So my angle is going to be probably more looking at focusing on focusing and discussing on the observations of what made a good practitioner and some observations on maybe some not so good practitioner characteristics, but also to kind of challenge the room and say there's some things that come up frequently that I've observed that we all do and we're all guilty of, and sometimes we need to be reminded when we're starting to think about how we want to train or certify the next group or certify ourselves to be at a certain standard. So that's the angle I'm coming at. The contents of mine is going to be looking at the different challenges. I'm going to look at the biases. I'm going to look at some limitations. I'm going to look at education and experience. And then I'm going to look at some of the opportunities in terms of do we reinvent the wheel? Do we enhance when we're doing impact assessment? And then how do we develop practitioners based on that? So what are some of the key findings that I think would add value if academia or a certifier or someone else is going to start building up the practice more formally? The purpose obviously being to identify the challenges and opportunities faced by practitioners to assist in developing the future. So some of the biases. I mean, everyone's in the room is probably sitting here and thinking, okay, I know the biases. There's some glowing obvious ones. I found this online I thought was quite telling, how many biases there actually are. And when I read it, how many I'm guilty of the first 5 I read, there was a component where I could see methodology, who I interviewed, how I absorbed the information. They all started to come up. So one of the 4 key themes are basically, what should I remember? Is there too much information? Do I need to act fast? Is there not enough meaning? And as practitioners, we face that all the time at various levels. And understanding the biases that are inherent with that, I think, is a critical component to developing quality practitioners. And some glaring obvious ones, obviously, is confirmation bias, which is prevalent in everything we do, whether it be us ourselves, who we're working for, what regulations we've chosen to use, or how the people that we're interviewing are actually giving us the information that we're supposed to process and turn into something tangible. So good practitioners understand bias, and we work to reduce it. Challenges and limitations. I thought I'd put this particular picture in for a few reasons. One is there's not a lot of stuff left to be blasting away with their hose to try and get at, but they're still out there. So there's a lot of limitations in what they're doing. They also have a lot of limitations in their equipment, but they're still giving it a go. Whether or not we enjoy the way they're doing it is probably a secondary question, but there are limitations in what we do. So for me, I put a bunch of stuff up there just for you to have a read and understand, but for me the main things that pop out really are the consideration of culture, in culture and who's doing the assessments, but also in who we're integrating with and what standards we're using all bring culture along with it. And so we have to really get an understanding, and we want to have the future SIA practitioners really have a firm understanding of culture. It is a critical component in how we deal with people and how we're dealt back with, as well as gender and age. I mean, the last panel I was on was all male, and there was several notes made of that. It's because we see things and approach things differently, and that's a good thing. And we should be really looking at what the limitations are of my perspective from my ideological stances and my political stances to my gender and my age, and how we include more stakeholders and more people that don't necessarily fit our comfort zone into what we do. And so for me, that stands out as a critical component, as well as the power to observe, where we often have to do a lot of talking. Most of us want to do a lot of listening. The one of the best assessments I've ever done was sitting in a village with practitioners who knew what they were doing, and I had zero ability to understand the language. And the ability to sit back and observe how the interactions happened and what was being said is quite a powerful piece of skill to have. But we also have to understand that there's time frame issues that we have to get around, and we have to be able to understand that management component of that, how we influence the outcome of the product we're producing by how we understand our time frames and the limitations to that. And that can be the regulations, the proponent, the weather, our own availability. I think it's getting an all-rounder is a good standing point, but there's specific details we really want to pull out of this as well. We also, lastly, what our stakeholders know and omit and want us to know it was a really hard challenge, and so we want to be able to listen and hear what's being said, but also then know how to take it to the next level and say, well, I'm pretty sure you wanted me to hear that, but let's get the underlying reasons for why you wanted me to hear that so we can understand where you came from in developing that thought process. And I think that when you want to develop that skill set, that's something that for me that stands out. And the people I've worked with that can do that, it really shines in their outcomes of their work. I'm not sure what clicking is actually doing at this point. So yes, know your limitations and know how to address them. Education experience. It's having talked to the group and having the variance of the group of who's presenting. There's very much an experience side and an education side, and we both understand the limitations and opportunities of both. And so if it's finding that balance, and I think it's a lot like qualitative and quantitative data. You can do one or you can do the other, and you can get to a similar endpoint, but it's when the marriage of them together works the best that you get the best outcome. And so you need to find that balance. It's not just about time served, and innovation in the practice can come from anywhere. So I've had junior people come up with very profound understanding of something because they have none of the baggage that I carried with the other projects I've done. And so I think that's something to really consider in how we develop this, is how do we build up a good package of knowledge, but not limit ourselves with what we know. Probably should have clicked before that. Sorry about that. And it's I got ahead of myself and behind myself at the same time there. Balancing the academic sociology with the project requirements is I've found quite tricky. So I'm a sociologist by training, and in applying social theory, I've really struggled with the limitations of doing that. Most of which is, as the practitioner, I'm selecting the theory, and in reality, it should be the situation and the stakeholders that are selecting the theory, in which case I have to do a bit of research to figure out what's the best approach to take. And so I understand and I've talked to a lot of people in this room, there's a real drive to get more of the science or the practicality of the industry into it, but it's just understanding that we have to be really careful in how we apply it, because otherwise we're setting it up the way we want it, not necessarily the way a project should be developed. And one of the things I actually really find interesting is the team dynamic. And so there's some skills that can be attained, but there's also immutable characteristics that can really define things. In particular, when I was working in Papua New Guinea, I walked into a meeting with a health professional and came up with an understanding of the health issues. And the woman who was the PNG local who was running the women's group came out with significantly better information because they were more comfortable talking with her about their issues, and the women in the village saw health in a completely different spectrum than the men did. And so I think we really have to be conscious on who's in the team and how we build the team. And again, going back to our limitations, knowing what we can bring and then knowing who we need to bring on in order to get the best outcome, the best product. And so yes, we can train up and yes, we can be certified, but there's just some characteristics that can't be trained, and we need to remember that. And so, okay, so the opportunities to reinvent or enhance, I'll go through this quick, but just a little quick, funny one to chuck through. We have a framework of, well, we have the original assessment process of how we do things, and then we have a regulation and guidelines for consideration. But then we have a product that people actually want. And it's tailored to the needs of the project. It might be driven by the client, it might be driven by the community, it might be driven by us. But everyone in that picture there doesn't get to pick which wheel is done, they get to deal with the product. So we have to be very aware of who we're influencing and what we're actually delivering, and whether or not the standard that's been chosen by whomever to deliver what we're delivering actually delivers the product that people need. So summing it all up, I'll just put those up so people can read them while I'm going. There's an educational component I can see, so there's a potential for a stream down, maybe a bachelor, where you have an all-rounder, where you bring in a bunch of different study areas and say, here's the key things that you need from a psychology, sociology, cultural, anthropological, communications. And that's a stream in itself. But then there's also this training component, which says what's the skill builders or what's the accreditation that can be done. So if people already have certain skills, what can we do to enhance that? And then lastly, I think there's the experience component, which is the skill sharing side of it, of what can we bring as people who have experience to the next generation, and what can we do to fill the gaps in the data so that when we go to do the next study, we actually have something to source that's relatable in some way, or we can define how it's not relatable in other ways in order to build that quality set for the entire industry. So thank you for that.